She came to his grave in the rain alone, carrying a silence too heavy for words. She didn't expect anyone to notice her pain, but one man did. And when she knocked on his door weeks later, she had no idea it would be her own heart that opened. Before we begin this unforgettable story of love loss and second chances, if you believe in the quiet power of kindness, consider subscribing. These stories are for you. Now let me take you to the morning it all began. The rain came down in sheets that morning, relentless and cold, soaking through coats, boots, and bone. It bled into the stones of Arlington National Cemetery, making every engraved name shimmer like it had just been carved. Beneath a gray sky that refused to lift rows upon rows of white marble stretched across the landscape, like a solemn hymn, orderly, silent, sacred. Avon Calloway stood motionless, a lone figure beside one of the stones. She didn't bother with an umbrella. Her dark brown hair clung to her neck and cheeks, rainwater running down her jawline in perfect rhythm with her silent tears. In her hands, she clutched a folded flag, edges, frayed colors, dulled from years of holding on too tightly. It had been 3 years. 3 years since Grayson died. 3 years since her world stopped spinning. The rain didn't bother her. In fact, it helped. It disguised the crying, softened the sharpness of her grief. She stared at the stone until her eyes blurred. The name etched into it had once been a living, breathing man, a husband, a soldier, a dreamer. Now it was granite and shadow. A gust of wind knocked her balance slightly, but she didn't move. Let the cold take her. Let it numb everything that still remembered. She didn't notice the small pair of boots squishing through the wet grass behind her until a quiet voice whispered, "Daddy says, you'll get sick like that." Avon turned. The girl was around 7, wrapped in a too-big raincoat and pink galoshes decorated with stars. She held a bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in twine. Behind her stood a man, tall, with a lean build, wearing a worn denim jacket and holding a green plaid umbrella. His beard was neat, his eyes steady. He gave Avon a gentle nod. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping forward. "She worries about everyone." Avon blinked. "It's okay." The man looked down at the soaked flag in her hands, then back to her eyes. "He served," she nodded, unable to form the words. "So did I," the man said simply. "My name's Harlan. This is Aloan." The girl handed Avon the flowers. "They're for your person, too." Avon took them with a trembling hand. "Thank you." A silence fell, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Harlan reached up and shrugged off his jacket, holding it toward her. "You're freezing," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not." She hesitated, then accepted it. The inside was warm, dry. It smelled faintly of pine and smoke. "Thank you," she murmured. Harlan nodded, once, then took Aloan's hand. "Come on, kiddo. Let her have her moment." As they walked away, Avon watched them through the blur of rain. She didn't know why, but something about the simplicity of the interaction, the warmth of it cut through the fog around her like a quiet light. Later that afternoon, Avon sat inside a small olive-green tent, pitched near the cemetery's edge. It was regulation military weather, worn but functional. She had refused to stay at a hotel. This patch of earth felt closer to him. Grayson. It was where he belonged now, where she could still talk to him without anyone watching. She lit the small camping stove and boiled water for tea she rarely drank. Her uniform shirt hung from the inside beam of the tent, dripping onto the tarp below. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. It seemed to press down harder now, like it knew she was still here. Then, unexpectedly, she heard footsteps on the wet gravel. Avon unzipped the flap and peeked out. It was Harlan again this time, holding 2 steaming coffee cups from a corner diner. "Hope you're not allergic to caffeine," he said. She stared at him, blinking through the downpour. "Why are you here?" He shrugged. I lost my wife to cancer 4 years ago. Spent a long time sitting in cemeteries talking to someone who couldn't answer. Figured I'd bring you a cup like people used to do for me." She took the coffee, her hand still cold. "Thank you." He started to walk away, but stopped. "By the way, I've got a propane heater in my truck. Old, but works, if it gets too cold out here tonight." "I'll be fine," she said quickly. He looked at her for a long moment, then just nodded. As he disappeared into the rain again, Avon found herself staring at the coffee in her hands longer than she should have. It was just a gesture, sure. But for the first time in weeks, it reminded her of something she'd forgotten how to feel seen. That night, the wind picked up. The tent shook slightly as Avon curled inside her sleeping bag, still wrapped in Harlan's denim jacket. The flag lay folded beside her. She kept reaching for it, like it could hold her together if she fell apart. She thought of Grayson, of the last voicemail he left her cut off by static, of his laugh, of the promise they made, "No matter where you are, I'll find my way back to you." But he hadn't. The truth sat heavy in her chest. Maybe that was the hardest part, knowing he had no choice. But she did. She could leave. She could live. She just didn't know how. Outside, the rain kept falling. The morning came slow and gray, shrouded in mist so thick it dulled even the neat white rows of the cemetery. The rain hadn't stopped. It hadn't even paused. Avon could hear it drumming on the roof of her tent, like an old hymn, steady, sorrowful, familiar. She'd barely slept. Wrapped in the remnants of a dream and Harlan's denim jacket, she stared at the ceiling of the tent. It leaked in one corner now. She hadn't bothered to fix it. Let it drip. It felt right. By the time she stepped outside the cemetery, grounds were a slurry of mud and pooled water. Her boots sank in with each step as she made her way to Grayson's grave. She didn't cry this time. She just sat, folded her legs beneath her, and rested the coffee cup from the night before against the stone like a quiet offering. Then she just listened to the silence, to the rain, to her own breathing. That was when she heard the sound of tires crunching slowly over gravel. Avon turned and saw a dusty pickup truck rolling into the edge of the cemetery. The tailgate was dented. The left taillight was cracked and patched with red tape. Of course it was him. Harlan stepped out, umbrella in hand, holding something wrapped in aluminum foil. "You can say no," he said as he approached. "But this is my daughter's banana bread. It'd break her heart if I brought it back uneaten." Avon raised a brow. "You sure she baked it for me?" "No," he said, cracking a smile. "But I'm learning that you only win battles with truth when it comes to 7-year-olds. She allowed the hint of a smile to touch her mouth, barely there, but genuine. She took the foil. "Thanks. I can leave you alone." She hesitated. "No," she said. "Stay." They didn't speak for a while. He stood beside her, umbrella held above both of them. She broke off a piece of bread and ate it in silence. It was surprisingly good. She really made this with a little help, but she takes credit regardless. The faintest chuckle escaped Avon's throat. She looked sideways at him, his face worn honest, steady. The kind of man who didn't fill silence because he feared it. He just let it be. That was rare. By late afternoon, the rain had taken a turn. It wasn't just steady anymore, it was heavy, unforgiving. The wind howled through the tree line, shaking branches and slapping the side of Avon's tent with muddy leaves. The temperature dropped. Water began seeping in through the zipper seams. She lit the small camping stove again, but the flame sputtered. Damn it. The tarp beneath her sleeping bag was soaked. Her dry clothes weren't dry anymore. The ache in her back reminded her she hadn't slept right in weeks. She sat on the damp edge of her cot, staring at her soaked boots, then at the walls closing in. She didn't hear the truck until the lights flooded her tent. Then came a voice loud over the rain. "Avon." She unzipped the flap and poked her head out. Harlan stood outside holding a large duffel bag and a canister. "I told you," he shouted through the storm. "If it got too cold, I had a heater." She blinked speechless as he dropped the duffel on the ground and began setting up a small propane heater near the tent's edge. "You don't have to do this," she called out, her voice hoarse. He looked up, soaked, his beard dripping. "You don't have to freeze either." "I'll be fine." I've heard that line before from people who weren't. She stepped out barefoot, now water slapping at her ankles. "Why are you doing this? I'm not your problem." He paused. Then more quietly, "Maybe I remember what it's like to be someone else's problem." The words silenced her more effectively than shouting could have. She looked down, her shoulders sagged. "Come with me," he said after a long pause. "Just for the night. I've got space. You'll be warmer. Drier. You don't have to talk. Hell, you can pretend I'm not even there." Avon looked back at the tent, the water pooling beneath it, the damp sleeping bag, the corner of the flag sticking out of her rucksack, its edge already stained. She nodded once. Harlan's cabin was tucked behind a ridge 20 minutes from the cemetery. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, sending dancing light across the pine floorboards. The place smelled of cedar and strong coffee. Alawan greeted her with a shy wave, holding a blanket patterned with stars. She made the guest room, Harlan said, even fluffed the pillows. Twice. Avon looked around. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm. Real. Lived in. She took the blanket from Alawan and mouthed, "Thank you." The girl beamed. That night, wrapped in dry clothes and cotton sheets, Avon lay awake, listening to the storm batter the windows. The flag rested on the nightstand, finally dry, the creases as sharp as they were on the day it had been handed to her. Grief was still there, heavy, permanent. But for the first time, it wasn't the only thing in the room. There was firelight, the distant hum of an old heater, the smell of banana bread, and kindness. She didn't know how long it would last, but for tonight it was enough. Morning came like a whispered promise. The rain had softened to a light mist hanging in the air, like breath on glass. Outside the cabin, wet pine needles blanketed the porch, and low-hanging clouds tangled in the trees, like wandering spirits, too tired to drift further. Avon stood in the small guest bedroom barefoot, watching a squirrel dart across the railing. She held her coffee cup with both hands, black hot grounding. The flag sat folded neatly on the nightstand edges, dry now, corners tight again. She hadn't touched it since last night, but she'd looked at it. A lot. There was something different in the way it sat now, less like a wound, more like a relic. Down the hallway she could hear Harlan moving about, quiet footsteps on creaking wood, the muffled clang of a pan on the stovetop. Alawan's voice floated from the kitchen, full of questions and mismatched sentences. The girl never seemed to stop wondering about things. Avon didn't know how someone so small could carry that much light. She wanted to leave before breakfast. She told herself she should, but she didn't. By the time she stepped into the kitchen, Harlan was plating scrambled eggs and bacon. Alawan sat at the table with a sketchpad tongue poking from the corner of her mouth as she colored in a cartoonish drawing of a woman in a poncho standing beside a flagpole. "She made you heroic," Harlan said with a smile, noticing Avon's glance. "I gave her lightning powers too," Alawan added proudly. Avon raised an eyebrow. "That explains the cape." The girl nodded, flipping a page to show another sketch. "This one's Daddy. I gave him boots that never slip." Harlan chuckled softly and handed Avon a plate. "Careful. The bacon's hot, but the compliments are hotter." Avon sat down the warm plate, grounding her more than she expected. She hadn't eaten a proper breakfast in weeks, months. "This is good," she said after a few bites. "Thank you." Harlan poured her a fresh cup of coffee, then sat across from her. He didn't say much. He just watched without judgment, without expectation. like he was waiting for her to breathe, not explain. It was disarming. Later that morning, Alawan tugged Avon's sleeve and led her outside. The girl skipped ahead, boots splashing in puddles, until they reached a patch of muddy garden near the shed. This used to be flowers, Alawan explained, but it rained too hard. Daddy says they'll come back if I try again. Avon knelt beside her. You believe that? Alawan shrugged. Sometimes I don't. But then I try anyway. That did something to Avon. A small, nearly imperceptible crack opened in the armor she didn't realize she still wore. Together, they planted a few new seeds. Radish wildflower, something called Texas bluebell, that Alawan insisted on pronouncing Tex bells. As Avon patted the dirt into place, she looked toward the cabin. Harlan stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed loosely, watching them with a look she couldn't quite place. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stayed. And in that staying, something inside Avon shifted. That evening, as Alawan went to bed after 2 stories, 1 stuffed bunny rescue mission, and a long, whispered question about whether ghosts sleep. Harlan joined Avon on the back porch. They sat in silence for a long while, sharing a blanket between them. I know this doesn't mean anything coming from me, he said, finally voice quiet, but I'm glad you stayed. She stared at the woods, rain dripping from the edges of the porch roof. I almost didn't. I figured. She took a slow sip of tea. I don't do well with people being kind. Harlan didn't look at her. You'd be surprised how many people don't. She turned to him. How did you do it? Do what? Survive it? He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was with his eyes still on the dark treetops. I didn't for a while, he said. I fell apart. Quietly. While everyone thought I was being strong. Avon knotted her throat tight. She knew that brand of silence too well. But Alawan was there, he continued. She doesn't understand death the way we do. She doesn't think in endings. Just pauses. Avon looked toward the window where Alawan's nightlight glowed. I envy that she whispered. So do I, he said, finally looking at her. But I'm trying to learn from her. Avon shifted in her seat, unsure how to respond, so she didn't. She just pulled the blanket tighter and let herself lean back slightly, her shoulder brushing his. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stayed. Later that night, back in the guest room, Avon lay beneath clean sheets and stared at the ceiling. Her hands rested on her stomach, the rhythm of her breathing slow and steady. But her mind spun. Harlan hadn't asked her for anything. Not her story. Not her future. He just gave her space. And somehow, that made her want to tell him everything. She reached over to the nightstand and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a notepad and pen, left there, maybe by accident, maybe for guests like her. She opened to the first page. Then for the first time in a very long time, she started to write. Not a report, not a checklist, not a condolence note, just a memory of who she was, of who she might still become. The rain had softened into a steady rhythm by morning, less furious now, more contemplative. It clung to the pine needles outside the cabin, like a conversation not quite finished, lingering on rooftops, windows the edges of memory. Avon stood by the window, arms crossed, mug of coffee untouched in her hands. From where she stood, she could see the corner of the garden she and Alawan had planted yesterday. The seeds sat hidden beneath the wet soil, not yet sprouting, not yet gone. Just waiting. Something about that felt familiar. She hadn't asked to stay another night, but Harlan hadn't asked her to leave either. That unspoken understanding settled between them like a blanket, warm, heavy, and impossible to fold neatly. Mid-morning brought quiet chores and a trip into the attic. I'm looking for a spare lamp, Harlan said, motioning to the narrow pull-down ladder in the hallway. Old house, old wiring. the porch lights blown again. Avon followed him up out of boredom more than necessity. The attic was filled with boxes labeled in faded marker XMS tools, baby clothes. She glanced at one labeled Grayson letters and paused. Her heart skipped. No, not hers. Someone else's. She moved past it unsettled. Here, Harlan said, digging through a box in the corner. Might be junk, but worth a shot. As he pulled out the lamp, Avon noticed something wedged behind the rafters, an old canvas pouch military issue with a rusted zipper and a faded name tag. Whose was that, she asked. Harlan followed her gaze. That belonged to Clara's father, my wife's dad. He was in Vietnam. Used to say he kept every letter he ever received. Probably just paperwork. He tossed the lamp onto the attic floor. Want to see? Avon hesitated. Can I? He handed it over. Sure. She sat cross-legged on the wooden floor and slowly unzipped the pouch. Inside were a few crumpled letters, yellowed with age. The ink faded to a ghostly blue. She unfolded one with care eyes scanning the words. Don't waste your second chances. There are men who won't get them. Live loud enough for both of you. Avon froze. The words were achingly familiar. Not the handwriting, but the sentiment almost identical to something Grayson had once said to her in a recorded message before his last deployment. If I don't come back, promise me something. Don't live quiet. Don't just survive. Live loud enough for both of us. Her hands trembled slightly. She had buried that message in a drawer months ago, too painful to play again. But now the echo of it sat on her lap, spoken by a different man decades earlier. Some truths, she thought, are universal. They pass through time, like rain through the soil, different storms, same ground. She gently returned the letter to the pouch and handed it back to Harlan. Your father-in-law was a wise man. He was, Harlan said, looking at her, lost his brother in Nam. Took him years to talk about it. When he finally did, he said the guilt nearly ate him alive. But he learned to plant things anyway. Said growing something, anything, was proof you hadn't given up. Avon swallowed hard. She didn't say it, but that struck her like lightning in still air. That night after dinner, Alawan brought Avon a small wooden box she'd painted in crooked stripes of red and blue. For your flag, the girl said simply. Avon opened it, revealing a felt-lined interior. Perfect size. No hinges squeaked. Did you make this? Daddy helped? I painted. It's beautiful. Alawan smiled, proud. Now it doesn't have to get wet anymore. Avon stared at the box, something clenching in her chest. Thank you, El. The girl blinked, surprised. That's what Daddy calls me. Avon smiled softly. Then I'm in good company. Later, Harlan offered to walk her to the guest room. She declined, but he waited at the hallway's edge anyway, as she paused beside the nightstand wooden box in hand. I read one of the letters, she said finally. Your father-in-law. He reminded me of Grayson. Harlan nodded. He reminded me of Clara sometimes. It's strange how the dead become bridges between the living. She looked down. I've spent so long pretending he was still here. Not because I believed it, but because I didn't know how to be. Me without him. I know that feeling, Harlan said, voice quiet. Do you still talk to her, Clara, all the time? He said. But I stopped waiting for her to answer. Avon exhaled more, like a release than a breath. You should rest, he added gently. I will. She turned to go, but then paused. Harlan. He looked up. I don't know what this is, she said, gesturing between them, but thank you for not asking me to explain myself. I don't need your explanations, Avon, he said. I just need you to know whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. She nodded, and for the first time in years, she believed it. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, but the air still held the scent of it, fresh pine-damp soil and smoke from the wood stove that had burned low through the night. The cabin creaked in the cold morning silence, like it too was trying to stretch old bones awake. Avon woke to the soft chirp of birds and the faint, almost imagined sound of someone humming. She lay still for a long moment beneath the quilt, letting her eyes adjust to the dim gray light filtering through the curtains. The wooden box sat on her nightstand, the folded flag nestled inside like something sacred. It wasn't grief that met her this morning. Not exactly. It was quieter now, less suffocating. A familiar ache like an old scar that sometimes caught the weather. She sat up, pulled on her sweatshirt, and stepped barefoot into the hallway. The house was still. There was no ticking clock, no harsh beep of a microwave, just the smell of fresh coffee and the gentle clatter of movement in the kitchen. Harlan stood by the stove in a flannel shirt and jeans, flipping pancakes with an almost meditative focus. Alawan sat at the kitchen table legs, swinging beneath her chair, coloring in a book that looked like it had already lived 3 lives. "Good morning," Avon said quietly. Alawan looked up and grinned. "I made the sun purple." "It works," Avon replied. "Purple sun kind of fits around here." Harlan glanced over his shoulder. "Coffee's hot. Mugs are in the cabinet beside the sink, unless Elle beat you to all of them." "I only needed one," the girl shouted, laughing. Avon found a mug with a chipped rim and a faded picture of a cartoon moose. It felt perfect. After breakfast, the 3 of them stepped outside. The air was cold but crisp, and the sun had made a timid appearance, half hiding behind thick clouds, but shining nonetheless. It was the first time Avon had seen the yard, without rain falling through it. The grass shimmered with leftover dew. The garden patch looked quiet, undisturbed. But Avon imagined the seeds Alawan had planted were stirring beneath the soil, preparing for their own quiet emergence. "Come here," Alawan said, pulling at Avon's hand. She led her to the side of the house where 2 old Adirondack chairs sat beneath a cedar awning. "My mom used to read here," Alawan said, crawling up onto one of the chairs. "Dad says the trees make this spot safe." Avon eased into the other chair. He's probably right. Harlan stood a few feet away, leaning against the porch rail. Clara always said trees could hear better than people. Said that's why they never interrupted. Avon chuckled. Then they must love this place. She noticed something then. There was no wall clock in the living room, no alarm clock in the guest room, no timers on the oven. The entire cabin existed outside of time, like it had made peace with stillness in a way the rest of the world had forgotten. "Is there a reason there's no clocks?" she asked, turning to Harlan. He shrugged. Clara hated them. Said they rushed her. "That's kind of brilliant," Avon admitted. "She was brilliant," Harlan replied simply. Later, as the afternoon passed with slow conversation and warm tea, Avon found herself sitting alone in the living room while Alawan napped and Harlan repaired a loose shutter outside. She picked up a photo album from the bookshelf. Nothing flashy, just a worn navy blue binder with family etched in gold on the front. She flipped through it carefully. There were pictures of Clara and Harlan on their wedding day, Clara's hair swept up in curls, her eyes bright with something wild and soft all at once. Pictures of Alawan as a baby, bundled in blankets squirming in Harlan's arms. Halloween costumes. Birthdays. A picture of Harlan asleep on the couch, Alawan curled like a kitten on his chest. Page after page of love. Imperfect, ordinary real. And then toward the back, Avon found something unexpected. A picture of Harlan standing alone in the garden, eyes closed, hands in the soil. The caption beneath, written in Clara's handwriting, read, "When you can't fix what's broken, grow something new." Avon stared at it until the words blurred. That evening, Alawan asked Avon to help her with something in her room. She followed the girl down the hall to find art supplies spread across the floor, glitter glue construction paper cut-up cereal boxes. "I want to make a sign for the garden," Alawan said. "To tell the seeds we believe in them." Avon smiled. I love that. They spent the next hour painting the words, still growing in bright purple letters, underlining them with painted raindrops and smiling suns. When it dried, Harlan helped them stake it into the soil. As they stood back and admired the crooked sign, Avon said quietly, "It's beautiful." Alawan beamed. "Even if they don't grow, they'll know we tried." Avon knelt and kissed the girl's head. "Yes, sweetie, that's what matters." That night, the fire in the hearth burned low, casting long golden shadows on the log walls. Avon sat beside it, sipping her tea slowly. Harlan entered the room and sat across from her quietly, without needing to fill the silence. "You good?" he asked after a while. She nodded. "Yeah, I think. I'm just starting to remember what that feels like." He tilted his head. Being good. Being still. They looked at each other for a long time, two people no longer racing away from their pain but resting beside it. Then Harlan said something so gentle she almost missed it. Maybe stillness isn't where life stops. Maybe it's where healing starts. Avon didn't respond, but she stayed. And this time she didn't feel like she was drifting. She felt like she'd anchored. The thunder arrived without warning. 1 minute the cabin was still quiet, as breath soft with the rustling of leaves in a spring breeze, and the next, a crack split the sky, followed by a low rumble that made the windows tremble. Avon froze at the kitchen sink, her fingers curled around a mug. She hadn't heard thunder like that since Kandahar. Her chest tightened before her mind could stop it. The sound had always made her jump. It wasn't the thunder itself, it was what it reminded her of. Mortar shells, alarms, screams. She let the mug go. It didn't break, but the sound of it clinking into the sink made Elowen look up from her coloring book across the room. "You okay?" the girl asked, blinking. Avon nodded, smiling too quickly. "Just thunder. Nothing to worry about." But her hands were shaking. That afternoon the rain returned with a fierceness it hadn't shown in days. It slapped against the porch, darkened the sky, made the trees look like they were swaying under a great weight. Harlan came in from the shed, rain dripping from his hair and jacket. In his hand, he held a tightly wrapped parcel, an old brown envelope, weather-worn and sealed with string. Mail came late. It was in the community box by the road, he said. "I think it's for you." Avon took the parcel with cautious fingers. Her name was written in a sharp, slanted script, familiar and formal. Her heart dropped as she recognized the handwriting. Captain S. Malone. She stepped into the guest room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. For a few minutes, she just stared at it. Then slowly she opened the string and unfolded the letter inside. It was brief. Avon thought, "You should have this. Took me too long to find it. You deserve the truth, even if it's late. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." As attached to the letter was a printed report, a scanned copy of a shift change log from Kandahar base, the date 4 days before Grayson died. The entry read, LTG, Calloway swapped duty rotation with LTA Calloway. Voluntary, confirmed. Her breath caught. The memory slammed back like the thunder earlier, hot, brutal, unforgiving. She remembered that week. She'd been exhausted, burned out. Grayson had kissed her forehead and said, "You take the night off, babe. I've got it covered." She had assumed it was casual, kind, just one of those everyday compromises couples made. But this document made it undeniable he had taken her place, on purpose, and he hadn't told anyone, not even her. The silence in the room thickened, pressing into her lungs. The storm outside howled, but it was nothing compared to the one rising inside her. She pressed a hand over her mouth and let the sob come. He had died for her, not just beside her, not just for duty or flag. For her, and somehow that made the grief heavier, not lighter, not noble, just unbearable. She didn't realize how long she sat there. When the knock came on the door, she didn't answer. But it opened anyway. Harlan stood in the doorway, his face lined with concern. He saw the papers in her lap, her damp cheeks, her clenched fists. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. She shook her head. Her voice was thick. "It wasn't supposed to be me." Harlan stepped inside and closed the door. She looked at him, eyes wet, jaw tight. "He took my shift. The night he died, it should have been me. I didn't know. I thought he was just being sweet. And I let him." Harlan didn't speak for a moment. He sat down beside her, careful not to touch. "You didn't let him," he said quietly. "He made a choice he probably would have made again 100 times over. That doesn't make it easier." "No, but it makes it his." Avon stared down at the paper in her hands. "I've lived 3 years pretending he was just gone, that I had no say in it. But now it feels like I was given something I never earned." "You were given time," Harlan said. "That's not something you earn. It's something you choose how to use." Avon swallowed. Her throat burned. "I don't know how to live with that." "I didn't either," he replied, voice barely more than a whisper. "After Clara, I was angry at her for months, because she never told me how bad it was, because she left me with a daughter and no idea how to be 2 parents at once. I loved her, and I blamed her all at once. And that guilt, it doesn't go away." He finally looked at her. "But it gets lighter when you carry it with someone." That did it. Avon leaned forward, her shoulders shuddering, and buried her face in her hands. Harlan didn't try to fix her. He didn't reach to comfort her. He just sat beside her, the way someone who understands loss knows how to sit close enough to feel far enough to breathe. When she finally spoke again, her voice was hoarse. "I feel like I died too. I've just been moving around since. Not really living." Harlan nodded. "Maybe that's what grief is. A second life you never asked for." "And love?" she whispered. He paused. "Maybe love is what lets you step into that second life without leaving the first one behind." They sat there for a long time, and when she finally looked up, the rain had eased into a soft, steady drizzle again. Like even the sky knew it had to slow down. It was still raining when she left. Not the heavy, punishing kind of rain, just a quiet drizzle. Like the sky had run out of strength, but couldn't quite stop weeping. The kind of rain that soaked you slowly, not with violence, but with resignation. Avon rose before dawn. She dressed without turning on the lights, folded the quilt at the foot of the bed, and placed the wooden box containing Grayson's flag gently into her rucksack. The photo Alowan had drawn of the 3 of them sat on the nightstand. Avon didn't pack it. She couldn't. She stepped quietly down the hall. The house creaked beneath her boots as if trying to protest. In the kitchen, she scribbled a note on the back of a grocery list. "Thank you for the shelter, for the kindness, for not asking me to be anyone but broken. I wish I were braver. I wish I could stay. But I need to figure out who I am without someone else's sacrifice. Maybe someday I'll find my way back. A." She folded it in half and placed it beneath the moose mug she had grown fond of its chipped rim, now oddly comforting. Then, without another sound, she walked out the door. By the time Harlan found the note, the sun was beginning to break through the gray, just faintly like a light hesitating behind a curtain. He stood in the kitchen barefoot, reading the words like they were written in another language. A language he almost understood, but didn't quite speak fluently enough to respond to. Alowan came in seconds later, rubbing her eyes. "Where's Avon?" she asked, yawning. Harlan folded the note and slipped it into his shirt pocket. She had to go. Alowan frowned. Why, he didn't have an answer. Miles away, Avon sat at a gas station diner along an empty stretch of road that cut through southern Virginia. She hadn't eaten. The coffee was lukewarm. A trucker coughed behind her, flipping through a tattered magazine. The radio played something tinny and forgettable. She stared out the rain-speckled window, unsure why she'd come here or where she would go next. All she knew was that she had needed to move. The grief had cracked open again, and even though Harlan had held space for it, had held her, she wasn't ready to be seen like that. Not completely. There was shame in being the one who lived. There was shame in being the one who left, and she had done both. She pulled the folded report from her jacket pocket, the duty log that changed everything. She'd read it a dozen times, but the words always blurred in the same place. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and whispered, "I'm sorry, Grayson." The words didn't fix anything, but they were real. She didn't notice the elderly man until he sat across from her. "Mind if I borrow this seat?" he asked gently, already settling in. His jacket was soaked, his hat too large for his head. Sure," she said, startled. He placed a small bag of popcorn on the table and unwrapped it with slow, deliberate fingers. "You're a soldier," he said after a moment, not looking at her. Avon stiffened. "Was. You carry it like you still are." She didn't reply. The man nodded toward her rucksack. "That flag doesn't belong in a bag. Not when you're carrying it for the wrong reasons." She looked at him sharply. "Excuse me." He tapped the bag. "Guilt's a heavy thing. But it's not the same as honor. One will crush you. The other will carry you." Avon swallowed her hands, curling into fists. "How do you know the difference?" The old man smiled, lines creasing like worn maps. "You'll know when you stop walking away from where you're supposed to be." She stared at him, stunned, but he only stood, tucked the popcorn bag under his arm, and said, "We all get lost. That's just proof we were going somewhere." Then he left. Avon turned back to the window, and that's when she saw it. Outside, just beyond the pumps, someone had drawn something on the fogged glass of the bus stop shelter, 3 stick figures standing under a curved umbrella. One tall, one smaller, one with curly hair and a cape. Her heart stuttered. She blinked, then ran. Back at the cabin, Eloan stood by the window, her nose pressed to the glass. "She's not coming back, is she?" she asked. Harlan didn't answer right away. He was still holding the note in his pocket, still hearing the silence she'd left behind. "I don't know," he said, finally. "But sometimes people need to leave before they remember where they belong." Eloan sighed. She forgot her picture. "She'll remember it," Harlan said softly. One way or another, they stood in silence. And outside, for the first time in weeks, the rain stopped completely. The sky had gone still. Not clear, just still. The kind of hush that comes after a long storm, where even the trees seem to pause and hold their breath. The wind had quieted the ground, still damp and dark, but the rain was done. For now. Harlan sat at the kitchen table, a half-drunk mug of coffee growing cold beside him. He hadn't slept well the past 2 nights. The house had felt unbalanced, like it was missing a beam no one could quite name. Eloan had stopped asking where Avon was. She just folded her drawings into little boats and sent them floating across puddles in the driveway, saying maybe the rain knows where to carry them. That morning, Harlan had opened the pantry and found a new sketch Eloan had taped to the inside door. 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one just beginning to return. By mid-afternoon, he found himself staring at the porch. He didn't expect her to come back. He wasn't sure he even dared to hope for it anymore. But something about the quiet, it felt different. Then, just as he turned toward the sink to pour out his coffee, it came. A knock. Soft. Unsure. But deliberate. He froze. His breath caught halfway between memory and disbelief. Another knock followed this one stronger, like she was afraid he wouldn't open, but even more afraid that he might. Harlan crossed the floor slowly. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a beat too long. Then he opened it. She stood there, hair wet from mist boots, muddy, a single suitcase at her side. Her jacket was zipped up to her chin, and she held something in her hands, a folded paper, and the wooden flag box, now polished, the brass edges cleaned. "I didn't know if I should knock," Avon said quietly. He didn't smile. "Not yet." "But you did." She nodded. They stood in silence. The air between them was fragile, like frost on the edge of a window, beautiful but breakable. Avon swallowed hard. "I left because I thought I had to figure out who I was. Without him." Harlan didn't speak. She took a breath. "But all I did was run. From him. From you. From her. From the life I was afraid I might deserve." He looked down at the wooden box in her arms. "I kept thinking of something you said," she continued. "That love doesn't replace the first life, it just lets you live a second one without leaving the first behind." Her voice cracked. "I think I'd like to try." Harlan stepped aside. "Then come in." Alowan heard the door close and ran into the hallway. When she saw Avon, her face lit up, not with surprise, but with relief. "I knew you weren't done," the girl said simply. Avon crouched down, wrapped Alowan in a hug that was tighter than words. "I missed your magic," Avon whispered. "I saved some." That evening, the three of them sat on the back porch, the air cool but dry, a blanket thrown across their laps. The garden was beginning to show tiny sprouts, green pushing through black soil, like hope making its slow return. Avon handed Alowan a small envelope. "I picked this up on the way back." Inside was a photo printed from the diner security camera, Avon staring out the window, lost in thought. It was grainy and colorless, but Alowan grinned like it was gold. "Is that when you saw the drawing?" Avon nodded. "I think the rain delivered it." Alowan held the photo like it was something sacred. Later, as the sun dipped below the ridge and the porch light flickered on, Harlan joined Avon by the steps. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder. "I'm not perfect," she said. He looked at her. "Good," he said. "Neither am I." She smiled, small but sure. "I'm still figuring things out." "So am I." Another silence passed. This one wasn't uncomfortable. "I brought something else," she said, pulling a folded sheet of paper from her jacket. "I started writing this the night before I left. It was meant to be a goodbye. But I never finished it." She handed it to him. He read the first lines, then the last. "But if I ever find the strength to come back, I hope the porch light is still on." Harlan folded the letter gently and slipped it into his chest pocket. "It's always on," he said. Avon exhaled like her lungs had waited weeks to do so. Then she looked out across the yard, where Alowan had planted a new sign in the soft earth. "Still growing," Avon whispered the words to herself. And this time, she believed them. Spring came in quietly. It didn't announce itself with color or fanfare, but with softer mornings and lighter skies. The frost pulled back, the wind warmed, and somewhere between coffee and laughter, the earth beneath the cabin stopped weeping. Avon noticed it in the small things. The way the porch steps no longer creaked with cold, the scent of wild lilacs drifting through the cracked windows, the sound of Alowan humming again, not just out of habit, but out of joy. And in herself. In the way her hands no longer trembled when holding the folded flag. In the way her shoulders stopped tensing when Harlan walked into the room. In the way her smile, still cautious, no longer felt borrowed. They spent that Sunday morning stacking firewood. Harlan had chopped through 3 cords, while Avon organized them neatly under the porch overhang. Alowan darted back and forth with a small wagon, delivering kindling like a one-woman supply chain. "This one looks like a bear," she declared, holding up a log with a knot in it. Avon leaned over. "Looks more like a dragon to me." "Even better," Alowan said, tossing it onto the pile with dramatic flair. Harlan chuckled. "If this keeps up, I'm going to end up building a mythological fire." Avon smiled as she brushed wood dust from her hands. "Maybe that's exactly what we need." He looked at her. really, looked at her. She didn't flinch. That afternoon, Elowen tugged Avon's sleeve. "Can I show you something?" "Of course." The girl led her to the old storage room off the kitchen, a space they rarely used. Inside, Elowen pulled open a cabinet and revealed a small, weathered cassette player. On the shelf beneath it, a shoebox full of old tapes, each labeled in Clara's delicate handwriting. She used to record lullabies, Elowen said, for when I couldn't sleep. I haven't listened to them in a long time. Avon's breath caught. "Do you want to?" The girl nodded. They sat on the floor. Elowen inserted a tape. The machine clicked, then the soft crackle of static, and then a voice. Warm, gentle, familiar even to Ivan, who had never heard it before. "Good night, my little moon. The stars are waiting. Close your eyes and let the sky carry you home." Elowen laid her head on Avon's shoulder. "I remember this one," she whispered. Avon held her hand. They listened through 3 songs, and when the tape ended, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of love, of presence. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, the 3 of them sat on the back porch. The garden sprouts had grown a little taller. The sign Elowen had painted, still growing, now leaned slightly to one side, weathered, but still standing. Harlan brought out a guitar, dusty strings a little out of tune. "You play?" Avon asked. He shrugged. "Clara taught me 3 chords. That's all I've got." "That's 2 more than me." Elowen clapped. "Play the Rain Song," Harlan smiled. "You remember that?" Of course. He started to strum, simple, imperfect, but steady. Avon closed her eyes and let it wash over her. The melody was easy, the kind of tune you could hum without trying, the kind of song that felt like it had always existed somewhere in the bones of the house. When he finished, the world felt a little softer. "I think you've got 4 chords in you," Avon said quietly. He grinned. "Well, then maybe it's time to write a new song." Later that night, Avon stood in the guest room brushing her fingers across the spine of a blank journal. She hadn't written anything since returning. Not really. But her mind had begun composing thoughts again, observations, memories, small flickers of hope. She sat down and opened to the first page. She wrote, "Today, I stacked wood, sang with ghosts, and laughed with a little girl who believes dragons live in firewood. And I believed her. For a minute, I truly did. Maybe that's what healing looks like, one unremarkable miracle at a time." She paused, then added, "And for the first time, I didn't feel like a soldier pretending to be alive. I just felt here." She closed the journal gently, then turned off the lamp. Outside, the moon hung low above the hills, bright enough to silver the roof of the cabin. The firewood stacked beneath the porch glowed faintly from the porch light, as if holding its own kind of warmth. And somewhere in the soft, sleeping dark, the seeds in the soil stirred. The morning arrived with golden quiet. No thunder, no rain, not even mist. Just sunlight soft as breath slipping through the blinds and falling across the wooden floor like a promise. Avon woke early. For the first time in weeks, her sleep had been dreamless. Not from exhaustion, but from peace. She sat up slowly, letting the sunlight warm her face. The flag rested on the nightstand, still tucked neatly in its box. But beside it now was something new. A journal half filled its cover, worn from being opened each night. She reached for it, ran her thumb along the spine, and smiled. Today was the anniversary. 3 years since Grayson's final patrol. 3 years since she received the knock on her door. And today, for the first time, she wasn't drowning in it. She stood and walked barefoot into the hallway, following the scent of something sweet baking. Harlan was already in the kitchen, flour on his sleeves, a faint tune humming from his lips. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." Figured today needed cinnamon rolls. Avon smiled. That's unexpectedly perfect. He glanced at her. You okay? She nodded. Actually, yes, I think I am. Later that morning, Avon wandered outside alone. She carried a folded blanket, her journal, and a small wooden box in one hand. The sky was wide and open clouds, sparse and lazy. The air smelled of thawing earth and distant pine. She followed the trail past the garden across the ridge until she reached a flat clearing with a view that opened toward the distant hills. Clara had once brought her here, saying it was her thinking spot. Now Avon let it become hers. She spread the blanket on the ground, sat cross-legged, and placed the flag in front of her. She opened the journal and began to write. April 12th, 3 years today. 3 years of silence and rain and what-ifs. But today, I don't feel the weight. I feel the gift. You gave me this time. And for a long while, I didn't know what to do with it. But now I think I'm learning. She paused. I thought I had to live for you. But maybe grace and what you wanted was for me to live for myself. Fully. Deeply. Loud enough for both of us. She closed the journal gently and exhaled. Then she opened the flag box. Inside, tucked beneath the folded fabric, was a second letter she had written weeks ago, but never read aloud. She unfolded it now, her voice steady. I promise I'll remember you in the sound of boots on dry ground, in the light that hits the porch, just before dinner, in the strength it takes to open up again. But I won't carry you like a weight anymore. I'll carry you like a rhythm. She folded the letter back and placed it under the flag. Then she did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She stood, looked out across the open valley and smiled. Not just for Grayson, for herself. That afternoon, back at the cabin, Harlan and Elowen had set up a picnic table outside. A red-checked cloth flapped in the breeze, a jug of lemonade, a pie Elowen had declared a masterpiece even before it had cooled. Is this a celebration? Avon asked as she approached. Harlan gave her a quiet look. It's a day. And we're in it, Elowen added. That's reason enough. They sat down together, passing dishes, sharing laughter, letting the wind carry the quiet between them. Elowen held up a drawing. I made this for you, she said. It was simple. A sun with a purple smile, a cabin, 3 people holding hands, and in the background, small but clear, a green sprout breaking through dark soil with the words written above it, still growing. Avon stared at it, her heart thudding gently in her chest. She took the paper carefully and looked into the girl's bright, serious eyes. Thank you, she whispered. That evening when the stars came out, Avon sat on the porch steps beside Harlan. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his hand over hers. The world wasn't fixed. The ache hadn't vanished. But something inside her had finally turned toward the light. She had been given time, and now finally she was choosing to use it. It was early May when the letter arrived. Not in an envelope, not through the mail, but in a child's hands, creased, fingerprinted, folded into quarters, with an imperfect heart drawn on the back. Avon found it on her pillow one evening after dinner. Elowen had already gone to bed, and Harlan was outside stacking tools in the shed. She opened it carefully. Inside, written in careful block letters, were 4 lines. Dear Avon, I'm glad you came back. I think Grayson is too. Love, Elowen. Avon pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. Grief had changed shape. It no longer pulled her under. It stood beside her now, hand in hand, with memory no longer a shadow, but a silhouette. That weekend, Avon and Harlan walked with Elowen to the top of the ridge behind the cabin. The sun was soft that day, and the breeze held the scent of new growth. They carried with them a single object, the folded flag in its wooden box, polished smooth its brass hinges, now gleaming in the sun. At the edge of the ridge where the trees gave way to the sky, Harlan placed a small wooden bench, simple, sturdy handmade from the same lumber as the cabin porch. Avon set the box on it, not to bury, not to forget, but to rest. She sat beside it in silence, then turned to Elowen. "Would you like to keep it here?" The girl nodded. "That way, if someone ever sits here and feels sad, Elowen said they'll know someone was brave before them." Avon looked at her. "You're quite the philosopher." "I'm 8, Elowen said proudly. They all laughed, and the sound drifted into the trees like music that didn't need an audience. Later that evening, Avon walked alone through the garden. The sprouting radishes had come in strong. The bluebells were blooming, and the crooked sign that read, "Still Growing," was now surrounded by life. She crouched down and added a second sign, just a small one carved from driftwood she and Elowen had found near the river. It read, "Here is where I returned." That night, a light rain returned, barely more than a whisper. It tapped against the windows, kissed the rooftop, ran gentle fingers down the cabin walls. Avon didn't mind. She sat at the window, watching it, listening. She thought of Grayson, not the uniform, not the ceremony, not the folded flag, but the boy who had once danced with her, barefoot in a motel parking lot, pretending to tango in the middle of a road trip when their car broke down. The man who sang terribly laughed loudly, and always insisted she try the pie. He would have loved this place, the garden, the girl, the man who understood how to stay. And for the first time in years, she could think of him and smile without breaking. She whispered, "Thank you. Not goodbye. Just thank you." As the fire in the hearth faded to embers, Avon curled into the couch, wrapped in the quilt Elowen had called stormproof. Harlan joined her a moment later, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one and sat beside her. Not too close, not too far. Just right. They didn't speak for a long time. Then Harlan looked at her and said, "What comes next?" She didn't have to think. "Life," she said, "with all its mess. And music." He smiled. "I'd like to be in it with you," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You already are." Outside, the rain eased. In the soil, seeds continued their slow, stubborn reaching. And inside the cabin, under the soft ticking of time, finally welcomed back. Love quiet, imperfect, enduring took root and held. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Just drop the name of your town or country in the comments below. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to hear more tales of hope healing and the quiet power of love, feel free to subscribe. We're here to share stories that stay with you. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for spending your time with us today. Your presence truly means more than you know.